I saw the snow blowing in the wind and thought about how things had gotten worse. Even the Christmas music playing in my office couldn't lift my spirits. Times were tough, and I was on the brink of bankruptcy. But I had a plan that I hoped would turn things around. I looked at the nameplate on my desk, Tom Ambrose, President. It all started about 18 months ago when Windward Sport in Pearl announced it would close all its U.S. operations, including in my hometown of Milton, North Carolina. The fifth largest employer in the county was gone, and things worsened when the local Walmart announced it would shut down as soon as its new superstore opened nearby. Several other companies, including CVS, followed suit, and the national economy took a nosedive. Unemployment in our area rose to around 14 to 15% as the local economy collapsed. The radio station where I worked lost nearly 40% of its advertisers. I was struggling to pay the bills and was falling behind on the station's mortgage and a new site for the tower. Edgar Breener, the mortgage holder, was moving forward with foreclosure. I owed $37,000. It felt like I was just juggling bills to avoid getting further behind. Owning a radio station had always been my dream. My passion for radio began in second grade, watching the warm glow of the kitchen radio while my mom listened to WNW in New York. By high school, my love for radio had become an obsession. I did morning announcements and managed the school's audiovisual equipment, working part-time during the school year and full-time over the summer. Despite challenges and advice to cut my losses, I refused to give up. I pursued a business degree with a government scholarship and my parents' support, knowing it would help me when I eventually had a station. As soon as my parents dropped me off in my dorm room freshman year, I sought out the campus radio station and quickly volunteered. By senior year, I was the station manager, earning $500 a month. The only downside was dealing with Chad Duncan III, the editor of the school paper and an insufferable snob who boasted about his wealthy media family. Chad and I often clashed, especially when it came to budgets. When the budget was approved, the radio station received a $40,000 increase while the newspapers was cut by $25,000. Chad was furious, and his resentment toward the radio station, and me in particular, only grew. Chad had a girlfriend, Amanda Edwards, who was cute but not exactly stunning. Chad broke up with her halfway through senior year, which devastated Amanda, a student of interior design. She started working at the radio station, where I hired her as a roving reporter and editorial writer. Chad was enraged by this and escalated his attacks against me in retaliation. He complained to the university president that we were wasting our budget on pizza and beer, even though we paid for those parties ourselves. I defended the station with receipts, and no action was taken against us. Despite my efforts to settle the dispute, Chad saw it as weakness and stepped up his attacks. Finally, we got our revenge with the help of Billy Williams, a computer science student, who figured out how to intercept the paper's digital files and replace them with our edited versions. We filled the paper with silly stories, limericks, incomplete sports scores, and ridiculous editorials calling for things like nap time and beer fountains. The university loved the prank, but Chad was determined to find out who was behind it. He barged into my office, accused me of the prank, and swore revenge. Although the prank was successful in stopping Chad's negative articles about us, the administration had reprimanded him for abusing his position. Chad was the kind to hold a grudge. Meanwhile, Amanda and I started seeing each other. After the prank, we were both unhappy in our jobs. Amanda didn't like her boss, and I felt the financial products I was selling were subpar. A year later, Amanda announced she was quitting to start her own interior design business. Looking back, this was the first sign of trouble in our marriage. With only one stable income, I was paying most of the bills. After we married, I split my bonuses between our new house fund and my radio station fund, 80% for the house and 20% for the station. Amanda contributed her earnings to the house fund, but when she quit without discussing it, I changed the split to 50-50. This should have been a warning sign. A year later, my job offered me the opportunity to open a new office in Greenville, North Carolina. Amanda was facing challenges with her business in our current location and was excited about the move. The transition went smoothly, and Amanda's business grew, though not as much as when she worked for a larger company. I wasn't fond of the job, so we settled into a rented house, exploring antique shops and having lunch together. One day, While exploring a residential area, Amanda, intrigued by the variety of houses, insisted we check out a 2-story colonial house with an open house sign. While Amanda toured the house for the second time, I noticed a radio station across the field behind it. The sign read WJT 1590 AM, your local radio station, though the letters were faded. I went to the station and met Mrs. Sylvia Porter, who was surprised because she thought she had locked the door. She owned both the house and the station. Her husband had expanded the station years ago and built the colonial house for their family. After her husband passed away 2 years prior, Mrs. Porter struggled to keep the station running and had shut it down 5 months earlier. She was planning to sell the property since the station's license was up for renewal, and she didn't want to renew it. During my conversation with Mrs. Porter, it became clear that she wanted to move to Florida to be closer to her daughters. She was frustrated because no offers had been made on the station, and in the past 2 years, she had tried to sell it but failed due to financing issues. She was reconsidering her decision not to finance the sale herself. I became very interested in buying the station. When I told Mrs. Porter I was interested but lacked the funds, she offered to hold a mortgage for me. I was thrilled. I went back to Amanda, who had fallen in love with the house, and told her I wanted to buy the station. I also mentioned my interest in buying the house, and she agreed. Initially, Amanda wanted to use our funds solely for the house since it needed repairs, but I convinced her that buying both properties together would get us a better deal. By the end of our conversation, Amanda agreed, and we made an offer of $200,000 for the house and $100,000 for the radio station, which was valued at $75,000. Mrs. Porter accepted and agreed to finance both sales at 4% for the house and 7% for the station. We signed the papers that day. 4 weeks later, we closed on both properties, putting down $330,000 for the house and $20,000 for the station. The remaining funds were allocated to restoring the house and covering the station's operating costs. 2 days after closing, we moved into our new home. The 45-minute commute to Greenville was a drawback, but owning a radio station made it worthwhile, and the steady income lightened the load of both mortgages. We immediately began renovating the house. A painter handled the interior and exterior, while a flooring company refinished the wood floors, installed carpets, and added tiles to the kitchen and bathrooms. Amanda also hired a handyman to fix the windows and the railing. For the radio station, I hired Scott Wright, Mrs. Porter's former engineer, to assess our needs. His report detailed necessary upgrades, including a new automation system that cost nearly $4,000 but promised to streamline operations. I programmed the station with a mix of hits from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, along with classic country, which proved popular with listeners. Scott also revealed that Fred Porter had previously planned to move the station's tower closer to Greenville, which would improve the signal. Fred had secured FCC approval, but the permit was nearing expiration. I renewed the permit but put the project on hold due to the $125,000 cost to build the new site. I took a week off to help with the house repairs and set up the new automation system at the radio station. After uploading the music and adding station identifiers, I turned the station back on. The response was excellent, and within 2 days, my first advertiser, Kaner from the local funeral home, signed up. Over the next 18 months, 2 issues clouded my happiness. I decided to quit my job in Greenville, but Amanda was upset because her interior design business wasn't thriving as expected. To convince her, I created a spreadsheet showing that resigning wouldn't impact our lifestyle. I demonstrated that the radio station's revenue could cover almost all our expenses, with a small deficit of $1,000 that I would cover. To sweeten the deal, I offered to advertise Amanda's business on the station for free. She loved the idea, especially since she could record her own ads. This plan was part of my strategy to attract new advertisers. I visited local businesses, gave them small promotional items, and explained the benefits of radio advertising. I encouraged them to record their own ads to create a personal connection with potential clients. For the next 3 years, I lived my dream with a loving wife and a successful radio station. But despite this high point, my life took a turn for the worse, and I faced the possibility of losing everything. Determined to save the station and my sanity, I fought hard to turn things around. One person who relied on the station was Luke Albert, a former DJ whose career had been derailed by alcoholism. A month after relaunching the station, Luke showed up, reeking of alcohol but with extensive radio experience. I took a chance and hired him for the 7 a.m. slot, despite others' warnings. Luke struggled with drinking at first, but gradually stopped and became a reliable part of the team. His morning show, though clumsy initially, became a hit with engaging stories and music that won over listeners, despite frequent technical issues. Another person who joined the station was Jimmy, a red-haired young man with a disheveled appearance who came from a troubled background. His father had left, and his mother struggled with alcoholism while raising 4 kids. I asked what I could do for him, and he looked at me and said, "Sorry, I can't do that for you." I stopped him and asked his name. He told me he was Jimmy Saunders. I offered him a tour of the station, and he was thrilled, overwhelmed by the opportunity. He reminded me of myself at his age, fascinated by the world of radio. He seemed completely captivated as we moved from room to room. When the tour ended, Jimmy was reluctant to leave, so I suggested he could do some volunteer work at the station. His face lit up, and he eagerly agreed. I gave him 2 WJT t-shirts, which he held tightly. When I mentioned he'd need to shower before coming in, his joy turned to panic as he explained that he didn't have running water at home and could no longer use the high school locker room. I assured him it wouldn't be an issue. He quickly learned production techniques and started producing commercials, earning $100 a week, which he used to support his siblings. After 3 months, I gave him a night shift. His program covered high school events and continued playing our music. With the program's success, Jimmy's standing at school improved, and he was no longer seen as an outcast. I had taught him to operate the equipment at football games, and eventually, I hired him for the afternoon show. 2 years later, he was ready for a DJ job in a bigger market. Jimmy also solved a significant issue with broadcasting high school football games from 5 schools. He suggested broadcasting 2 games per school, helping everyone stay engaged. 2 years after buying the station, I found a 10-acre site for the new tower. It was swampy land owned by Edgar Brenner, who wanted $88,000 per acre, far above its value. Brenner insisted on selling the entire 10 acres and only offered a 5-year mortgage with high interest. With no better options and hoping the station could handle the mortgage, I bought the land on his terms. About 6 months after purchasing the land, I needed a part-time accountant to manage the books, answer phones, and handle bills for about 20 hours a week, paying around $200. I advertised the position but got no responses. Just as I was about to give up and wait until I could afford a full-time employee, a young woman showed up one morning, looking nervous and reminding me of Jimmy. She asked if the job was still available, showing the newspaper ad. I invited her in. She was about 20 years old, around 5 feet 3 inches, with light brown hair and a ponytail. Her clothes were wrinkled, and her shoes worn, but she had a pretty face and a shy smile. I introduced myself and asked about her experience. She didn't have a resume and seemed concerned when I asked. She had no experience in accounting but knew how to use a word processor. When I asked if she had a computer, she said she did but didn't know how to use it. Then, a little girl's voice called out, "Tracy." The young woman stood up quickly, apologized, and explained it was her daughter. I had told her to bring the girl in. The child was about 3 or 4 years old, with blonde hair tied with a pink bow and a lollipop-stained smile. She held her mother's hand and sucked her thumb. After Tracy sat back down, Kimberly climbed onto her lap, resting her head on her shoulder, asking if they could eat soon. I offered Kimberly a cookie from a Tupperware container, which made her eyes light up. I gave her a couple more, mentioning that they were homemade chocolate chip cookies from Mrs. Mears, who brought them weekly as a sort of bribe to keep her favorite music on the air. Kimberly eagerly ate the cookies while Tracy took one, too, keeping her eyes on me, clearly anxious about the job. Seeing Kimberly on Tracy's lap and realizing the need, I decided to offer her the job. Tracy was delighted and grateful. I told her I would prepare a W-9 form to complete the paperwork. As I went to get the form, I overheard Kimberly asking if they would have to sleep in the car again that night because it was cold. Tracy's sad response made me reconsider. I returned to offer them a tour of the station, starting with the radio side. Kimberly was fascinated watching the live broadcast, and I saved the residential part of the tour for last. I explained that the previous owners had lived in the building while raising their children until they moved into a new home. I showed Tracy and Kimberly the residential side of the station and then made them an offer. They could use the space at the station until they found a place of their own. I reassured Tracy, who moved in and started working at the station. Initially, she said she'd find a place soon, but later admitted she couldn't afford one. She had left an abusive boyfriend and was grateful for the shelter. Hiring Tracy turned out to be a great decision. She quickly mastered the spreadsheet program, reorganized our filing system, established a billing schedule, and worked far more than her contracted 20 hours without complaint. After 3 weeks, I felt bad about paying her so little, so I increased her salary to $50 a week and offered her a 25% commission on any ad sales she made. Tracy excelled in sales and soon earned an extra $400 to $500 a month in commissions. I enjoyed having Tracy and Kimberly around. Tracy was always willing to help, and although Kimberly wasn't allowed into the locked transmitter room, she played in the studios when no one was working. Amanda wasn't happy about Tracy and Kimberly staying at the station. She was concerned about appearances. Although she knew they had been living in their car, she was still worried about how it looked. This should have been a warning sign, but I ignored it. Despite this, everything seemed perfect. Amanda's business thrived thanks to our ads, and our neighbors were friendly. Mrs. Mayer baked for us, and the neighborhood kids played games outside the station. I joined in when I could, even adjusting my game to keep it fair. My favorite neighbor was Henry Wilson, a retired Marine, who regularly came by for coffee and shared his stories, some exaggerated, but always entertaining. He was struggling financially with medical bills and refused to go to the local hospital, which he considered subpar. I agreed. It was a shame how poorly many veterans were treated. People often say you can count on death and taxes, but they're wrong. The only certainties are death and change, and my little paradise was no exception. The local economy started to crumble with the closure of the Wyver factory, followed by the exit of Walmart and a major pharmacy. The national recession hit everyone hard, including the radio station, which saw a 20% drop in advertising revenue. I tried to mitigate the damage by bartering for essentials like gas and gym memberships. Small businesses started to fail, which led the Chamber of Commerce to look for new businesses to replace the lost jobs. I was elected to the committee working on this. Then came Chad Duncan III, a new player in our small town. His family owned numerous newspapers, magazines, and stations. Chad hired Amanda to decorate the office for his new paper, the Milton Free Press. Despite my discomfort, I didn't act on it. The chamber saw Chad's move as a positive sign, but it was misleading. The newspaper hired only 3 locals and outsourced everything else, including printing. Chad seemed to blend in well, donating generously and joining local service clubs. He was expanding his family's media business into the Southeast, with plans for new newspapers and a fishing and home magazine, which helped Amanda's business. Amanda began coming home later and spending nights in Greenville for meetings, which was a major red flag. I noticed Amanda distancing herself from me and tried to win her back with flowers, gifts, and dates, but nothing worked. I considered confronting Chad, but realized it would only get me into trouble. Amid my financial struggles, my wife of 8 years had betrayed me with someone I despised. It was incredibly painful, and I decided to end things myself rather than beg, like my Uncle Fred, who had a breakdown after his wife left him. One night, I came home and found Amanda and Chad in the living room. It hit me that Chad had finally gotten his revenge for our college prank by taking my wife. 2 things helped me get through my divorce. First, when Amanda said she wanted a divorce, I stayed calm and simply said I was okay with it. My lack of visible emotion seemed to unsettle Amanda and frustrate Chad, which strengthened my resolve to act as though the divorce wasn't a big deal. Second, during negotiations, Amanda wanted the house, and I wanted the radio station. She proposed taking half of the station, but I calmly told her she could have it, including half the debts, which made her reconsider. We agreed to appraise both the house and the radio station. The house was valued at $20,000 to $40,000 more than the station, but Amanda complained about having to pay even $10,000. Despite her complaints, I stayed calm and had my lawyer request spousal support from Amanda, who was earning more due to Chad's help. The first thing I did was remove all of Amanda's ads from the air and offered an incredibly low rate to Mage's Interior Designs, a competitor. When Amanda found out and called me, she was furious. "You've got to be kidding," Amanda said incredulously. I made it clear there was no space available for her ads, which only made her angrier. Next, I targeted Chad's businesses. I approached his advertisers and persuaded them to split their ad budgets between his newspapers and my radio station. Surprisingly, around 40% of them agreed, which gave us a small revenue boost and infuriated Chad. As the divorce dragged on, Amanda and Chad flaunted their relationship around town, which bothered me even more. I instructed my lawyer to tell Amanda's attorney that we'd go to court if necessary. At a tense meeting, Chad showed up and refused to leave, prompting me to suggest ending the meeting and letting the court handle it. After a brief discussion, Amanda's lawyer invited us back in, and Chad stormed out in anger. "I can't understand why you treated me so poorly. If you wanted to end our marriage, you didn't have to cheat. All you had to do was ask for a divorce, and I would have agreed. I expected more from you, and I'm deeply disappointed." Amanda's face turned bright red but didn't apologize. My lawyer stepped in at this point. "Mrs. Ambrose, I have records of your income over the past 2 years, as well as Tom's. You earned around $30,000 more than Tom." "That's just ridiculous," Amanda replied. "Tom, if you're trying to get back at me, I'll fight," she said with a sad smile. I replied calmly, "Amanda, I really don't want alimony. But you're not even willing to pay me half of the lowest value between the two properties. Your lawyer will probably advise you that the court might make you pay at least $10,000 or even $115,000 based on the average appraisals. There's also a chance they'll go with the highest appraisal, which would be $20,000 plus alimony. So why don't we just settle for $115,000? Amanda looked at me for a long time, her anger seeming to fade as she calculated the situation. It was obvious that any love she once had for me was gone. After a long silence, Amanda agreed to the deal. "I think we're done here," I said, trying to sound positive. Before leaving the conference room, I approached Amanda. I kissed her on the forehead and said, "I hope you and Chad find happiness together." I paused at the door and repeated, "I really hope you and Chad find happiness together." It was a small victory, but it felt satisfying. 2 things helped me through my divorce, and Tracy and Kimberly were probably the most important. There were bright spots during a time of pain and sadness. Although my relationship with Tracy had always been strictly professional, it was comforting to have her support. When I had to move out of the house I'd shared with Amanda, she offered to help me find an apartment. "Don't bother with an apartment. We could just share the house instead," she said. "Don't waste your money on a new place." "I'll just lock my bedroom door so you don't get any ideas," I joked, and Tracy blushed. "Kimberly and I love being here, and we'd really like you to stay with us full time," she said. Her presence was a relief. I wouldn't have been able to handle the loneliness on top of everything else. Tracy and Kimberly's company helped me heal. Over the weeks, we went from employer and employee to friends, and then very close. The night of our first date was eye-opening. Tracy looked stunning in a dress and makeup. We quickly became a couple, started spending the nights together, and even talked about marriage. Amanda and Chad were in the past. But then Tracy and Kimberly left, and it was my fault. It all started with the china set for my family. Amanda had asked for it, and I agreed without realizing it would upset Tracy. She felt I was still letting Amanda get her way, and our argument escalated. The next morning, Tracy and Kimberly were gone. I was devastated but had to focus on a major presentation that night. Oregon was out due to civil unrest, and California was out because of high taxes and regulations, leaving North Carolina as the best option. Our committee had worked hard on our proposal, and Milton was a finalist. We had a promising site with a 400-acre industrial park near the interstate and a rail spur. It all depended on our presentation in Ash. If Sterling Pharmaceuticals chose our site, it would bring hundreds of construction jobs and 250 permanent positions. Abbott Medical Supply had also shown interest in our area if Sterling came. The presentation was scheduled for 7 p.m. in Ash, and I was chosen to present to Sterling Pharmaceuticals. That afternoon, I was preparing tax forms when I noticed an unusual silence. I ran to the studio and discovered that although the music was playing, the main transmitter had shut down. Jimmy offered to switch to the backup transmitter while I investigated the main one. The backup, while operational, was old and prone to overheating. I asked Jimmy to contact our engineer, Scott. 10 minutes later, Jimmy returned with Scott on the line. Scott advised opening a window in the transmitter room to cool it down and removing the transmitter's back panel. As a snowstorm was approaching, he suggested closing the window later and lowering the thermostat to 55 to prevent overheating. I instructed Jimmy to close the window and turn down the heat before leaving. I also asked him to check on Henry across the street, who was struggling to shovel snow. As I drove toward Ash, the snow began falling heavily, reducing visibility and making me anxious about being late. I decided to take a mountain road that, though risky in winter, would save me about 40 miles. My phone rang just as I was deciding on the mountain road. It was Stan Willard, the mayor and head of the Chamber of Commerce, who was panicking because he'd forgotten his flash drive. Stan couldn't make it due to a family emergency. He stressed how crucial it was for me to make the presentation, as Sterling Pharmaceuticals was likely to choose our location. Reassuring him that I still had an hour and trusted my snow tires, I took the mountain road. The snow and wind were manageable until an animal darted across my path. I swerved sharply to avoid it, causing my car to skid and roll over. The car flipped 3 times, hitting at least one tree before I lost consciousness. When I woke up, the car was upside down and partially crushed. I felt severe pain in my right leg. I could move my arms and left leg, but my right foot was trapped. The driver's side window was broken, and blood covered my face. I felt dizzy and nauseous. I managed to pull out my phone and dial 911, but there was no signal, and the battery was nearly dead. The realization hit me hard. I wouldn't make it to the presentation, and I had lost my chance to save the radio station. Trapped and freezing, I felt a wave of despair thinking about letting everyone down. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, I reflected on how much I had failed. I was cold, in pain, and covered in blood. Just when I was about to give up, I heard someone approaching. It was Henry. "Tom, thank God I found you," Henry said as he reached me. "What are you doing here?" I asked weakly. "I thought you'd take the mountain road." I tried calling for help, but there was no signal, so I walked the last stretch, he said. "I've ruined everything," I whispered. "I should have stayed on the main road. Now the whole area will suffer." Henry sounded almost angry. "Stop blaming yourself. If it weren't for you, Sterling wouldn't have even heard of our area." Exhausted, I said, "I'm so tired, Henry. I just want to give up." Henry insisted, "Stop it, Tom. You have to stop blaming yourself." I tried to laugh but ended up coughing hard. The dim light from my car made it difficult to see, but I felt hopeless. "I'm a loser, Henry," I said. "Everyone, my wife left me, the radio station failed, and Tracy's gone. Maybe coming to Milton was a mistake. If I hadn't, Amanda wouldn't have met Chad, and I'd probably still be married." Henry shook his head. "Do you really believe that?" he replied. "Everything would be better if you hadn't come here, but it looks like I won't make it out alive." "I'm so cold and in so much pain," I said weakly. Henry, with tears in his eyes, said firmly, "I don't believe that. If you hadn't come to Milton, I wouldn't have met you. You've been one of the best things to happen to our town." I was surprised by his emotion. "You've been kind, Henry, but not even my own father thought much of me. I'm just too tired to care." "You're wrong," Henry insisted. "I'll prove you're wrong. But right now, we need to keep you alive. Don't bother." "I'm not worth it," I muttered. "Nonsense," Henry said. He cleared a space around the window, sweeping away the snow and revealing some dried leaves and twigs. Using old gas receipts and crumpled leaves as kindling, he arranged the sticks on top. With a lighter his wife had given him, he started a fire that warmed my face, even though my body ached. Henry kept feeding the fire, and although it provided some warmth, I stared into the flames, lost in thoughts of my life's failures. I'm not sure if I fell asleep or passed out, but I had a disturbing dream. I was outside the house Amanda and I had rented in Greenville with a young man I didn't recognize. "This is where I used to live," I said. "Yes, I know," he replied. I saw a new Mercedes in the driveway and Amanda, dressed in a revealing nightgown, kissing a man. "Amanda," I yelled. "Get your unfaithful self out of my house." Neither of them even looked in my direction. Apparently, they couldn't hear me. "They can't hear you," the young man said. "You once mentioned a perfect marriage. Is this what you had in mind?" I started up the driveway, wanting to hurt the guy who was with my wife. I'd never hit a woman, but I was seriously considering making an exception for Amanda. Just as I took another step, the scene changed. The image refocused, and I found myself standing in the snow outside a rundown trailer with the young man still by my side. A police car and an ambulance were parked nearby, their lights flashing. I recognized the trailer park, though it looked much worse than I remembered. Another police car arrived, and an officer got out. The new officer asked about the scene, and Fred explained that it was an overdose case involving a young man named Sanders, described as a troublemaker with a history of criminal behavior. No, it can't be Jimmy," I shouted. I had helped him graduate high school and had made his ceremony special. But the officers mentioned Jimmy's troubled past, and I feared the worst. Then they mentioned Lou Albert, who was found dead in an alley with a bottle of whiskey. I was devastated to learn that Lou hadn't quit drinking. The young man confirmed, Lou never stopped drinking because he had no reason to. As I wept, the scene changed again, and I was standing on an empty main street in Milton, with many stores boarded up. The town was struggling, far from thriving. Struggling to stand, I asked, "What happened?" "The economy's bad, but not that bad," the young man explained. "The economy is tough, but not terrible," he repeated. "You never moved here. No one ever heard of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, so they settled somewhere else. Without you, there was no progress. The town hit rock bottom, and it'll take a long time to recover, if it ever does." In shock, I watched as the scene shifted again, and I found myself in an abandoned Walmart parking lot, where a single car was parked in the shadows. It was Tracy's car. As I ran toward it, I saw Tracy and Kimberly in the back seat, huddled under a thin blanket. "Wake up, Tracy, please wake up!" I shouted, but they were gone. "This can't be happening," I cried. Tracy had a key to the station. She wouldn't have left Kimberly outside in the cold. The young man said quietly, "There's no station because you never came to Milton." I collapsed in the snow-covered parking lot, sobbing uncontrollably. When I opened my eyes, I saw Henry tending the small fire. "How are you feeling?" he asked, clearly worried. "Not good," I answered weakly. Henry said he was going to get help and instructed me to stay awake. "If you fall asleep, you may not wake up," he warned. I watched him climb up the embankment until he disappeared. I was in severe pain, struggling to breathe, but exhaustion made me want to close my eyes. Despite my efforts to stay awake, I felt myself losing the battle. Just as my eyes began to close, I heard voices calling my name. I tried to respond, but was too weak. The voices grew louder, and soon an EMT was kneeling in front of me. "Mr. Ambrose, can you hear me?" he shouted. I nodded slightly. The EMT checked my pulse and shouted to others to hurry. "He's in bad shape, hurry up and get him some heat." They added logs to the fire, which provided more warmth, but I was still freezing, with barely any heat reaching my legs. All I wanted was to sleep. I heard a loud buzzing and the metal of my car groaning as they used the jaws of life to free me. The noise was intense, but eventually, they pulled me out and placed me on a stretcher in the ambulance. I was barely conscious, but a surge of self-loathing hit me. Though I had been ready to die and to give up, I swore to never surrender again. I decided to keep the station running as long as possible, even if it meant being dragged out. Then things became blurry. The last thing I heard was that they were preparing me for surgery. Later, I woke in darkness, feeling someone holding my hand, but I faded out again. The next time I woke, it was daylight, and I was alone. Dr. Anderson, my primary doctor, stood by my bed. "You had 4 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and 3 broken bones in your right foot." Hypothermia was the biggest concern. The fire probably saved your life, he said. I didn't start the fire, I corrected him. Henry did. Dr. Anderson looked confused. Henry Wilson? That's not possible. He died of a heart attack yesterday. Jimmy Sanders found him and called the ambulance. That can't be, I insisted. Henry found me and started the fire. Dr. Anderson explained, what you saw was likely a hallucination. You were severely injured and freezing, and your mind turned to someone you trusted. It's a common reaction in such extreme situations. I considered the doctor's explanation and accepted it. It made more sense than thinking a deceased man had built a fire for me. A few hours after waking up in the ICU, they moved me to a regular room. As my mind cleared, I felt a deep sadness, not for the station but for Henry, Tracy, and Kimberly. Henry was my first true friend in the neighborhood. He had become like family. Despite his difficult past, including a tough service in Vietnam and the loss of his wife, he remained kind and supportive. I felt honored to have been part of his life. I set these thoughts aside and focused on the station's situation. When I called, I felt relieved as Jimmy answered and assured me that Scott had repaired the main transmitter and ordered the necessary parts. I wanted to talk more, but I had to end the call as Stan entered the room. Thank God we found you, Tom, Stan said, looking shaken. We had half the town out searching for you. You scared everyone. I'm sorry for all this and for missing the Sterling meeting, I replied. I shouldn't have taken the mountain road. Don't worry about that, Stan said, patting me on the shoulder. I did part of the presentation and then explained what happened. I had to leave to help find you. I'm sure we'll get a rejection letter soon, I said, feeling even more defeated. I'm not so sure, Stan replied. Mr. Sterling called this morning to ask about you. He wants to meet with you because he's impressed by how the whole town rallied to find you. I wasn't sure why Jeff Sterling wanted to meet with me, but I assumed the plant project was likely over. Stan, I have files on 6 other companies interested in expanding or relocating. Please take the files and get the committee working on new proposals, I said. Tom, Stan said, don't worry about anything except getting better. I'll try not to worry, but if they'll let me out tomorrow, I replied with a slight smile, I'll be on crutches for a few weeks. Let me know if you need anything, Stan said before leaving. A little later, Tracy appeared at my door, and my heart lifted. Can I come in? She asked with an uncertain smile. Yes, please, I said, opening my arms. I'm so glad to see you. I'm sorry for making you leave. I'm not here for the china, Tracy said, hugging me tightly and quieting me with her hand. I don't care about Amanda anymore. I assure you, I don't either. I don't love or hate Amanda anymore. I found someone much better. I kissed Tracy, and she responded passionately, holding me close and whispering, I love you so much. As Tracy sat beside my bed, Kimberly peeked around the door. Is it okay, Mama? Yes, you can come in, Tracy said. Is Mr. Tom still mad at us? Kimberly asked worriedly. No, Tracy answered with a radiant smile. Kimberly ran towards me, but Tracy stopped her just in time. The next day, Jimmy drove me back to the station, and Tracy had cleared a path so I could walk with my crutches. While I recovered physically, the station and my finances were in serious trouble. I was behind on bills, facing foreclosure on the new land for the tower, and close to losing electricity. My staff agreed to pay half their usual wages, but I was still struggling to make ends meet. Tracy refused any payment and cut costs wherever she could. She reused printer cartridges, made notepads from used paper, refilled old water bottles, bought food at the discount store, and found a second-hand coat for Kimberly. She also went out looking for new advertisers. I was deeply moved when Kimberly came to my office with her piggy bank and offered it to help pay the bills. I kissed her and thanked her, telling her to save it for something nice for her mom. I felt utterly overwhelmed and lost, but the only thing I held onto was Tracy and Kimberly. The thought of not being able to provide for them was crushing. The day before Christmas, I was in a deep depression, but then 3 unexpected visitors arrived just when I needed them most. The first visitor came to my office just after 9 a.m., a tall, distinguished man with short brown hair and a warm smile. I hoped he was an advertiser or someone who could help, but he wasn't. He introduced himself as Jeffrey Sterling. Standing on one leg to keep my balance, I managed to greet him. He told me he had come to meet the man the whole town had been searching for. Jeffrey explained that he was impressed by how the town had rallied around me, especially when the mayor interrupted his presentation to help find me. But he was even more impressed by the proposal I had sent him. He revealed that Sterling Pharmaceuticals had decided to build their new plant here. "It's official now," he said, encouraging me to announce it on the air. With that, Jeffrey left, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. I hobbled into the production room and quickly recorded an announcement of the big news, setting it to play every hour for the rest of the day. Almost as soon as it aired, my phone started ringing nonstop for hours. I took calls, mostly from committee members, assuring them that the news was real. The announcement was a big win for the area, but I felt it was still too late for me. The bank was unlikely to approve a loan until January, and I was on the verge of losing everything. Just after 11 a.m., John Speck, a local lawyer and Rotary Club member, arrived. I had tried to get him to advertise on the station before, but he'd always declined. Today, he was here for a different reason. John, who had been Henry Wilson's lawyer for years, informed me that Henry had set up a living trust before he died. Henry's estate included around $45,000 in investments in his house, which was worth about $225,000 and was fully paid off. While I was on the phone with Stan, who had just learned about the Sterling deal, John handed me a cashier's check for $4,975. He also gave me the keys to Henry's house, which I could choose to live in or sell. The house was valued between $225,000 and $250,000. I immediately asked John to put it on the market. After John left, I called Stan to share the news about Jeff Sterling. Stan was thrilled and could barely contain his excitement. I told him I had some errands to run and would catch up with him later. As I looked at the cashier's check, I felt overwhelmed by Henry's generosity and love. It made me think of the dream I'd had when I was trapped in my car, and I thought to myself, I'm so glad I found Henry. I was convinced it was his influence that had brought me through. I called Tracy, who ran to me with Kimberly, both of them looking concerned. I showed them the check and explained that Henry had left me everything. John had converted his investments and given me the check. We needed to deposit it and pay our most urgent bills, and I wanted to apply for a short-term line of credit. That day was incredibly satisfying. With Tracy's help, we prioritized payments for electricity and gas, along with overdue payments totaling around $4,500. At the bank, Slay Albert helped us calculate the land payment, leaving us with just under $1,400. Slay assured me that securing a $25,000 line of credit wouldn't be an issue given the inheritance. After finishing our errands, I took Tracy and Kimberly out for lunch. Tracy hesitated, worried about spending money, but I insisted. We had paid our critical bills and arranged a short-term loan, and we could expect around $200,000 from the sale of Henry's house. Kimberly was thrilled when I took her to her favorite place to eat. On the way home, Tracy and I decided to explore Henry's house. I had been there before, but had never really looked through his cabinets or wardrobe. One of the rooms was locked, but I had the key and was surprised to find a collection of about 30 tools, including 5 valuable antiques. I sold the antiques for nearly $10,000, kept a 40mm wrench, and sold the rest for $122,000. During our visit to Henry's house, Billy Richards, the paramedic who found me first, stopped by to return some items from my car, including my 9mm handgun and a lighter with a Navy emblem. It had definitely belonged to Henry, even though he'd never been in my car. I accepted it with some confusion. Before leaving, we watched It's a Wonderful Life over dinner by a lit fireplace, using Henry's old lighter. I'd always loved It's a Wonderful Life, but this time, I realized how closely it reflected my own experiences. After the movie, I tucked Kimberly into bed and joined Tracy, who was looking through Henry's photo albums. One picture caught my attention, a young Henry with his wife. The young Henry in the photo was the same person I'd seen in my dream. I realized then that Henry had truly been my guardian angel. That Christmas was unforgettable. I was with my loved ones, and thanks to Henry's generosity, my financial worries were eased. Though the economy was still challenging, hope filled the town. Months later, Tracy and I were happily married, and 7 months after that, we had a son named Henry. When the virus hit on day 19, our fears grew. Henry contracted it, starting with a mild cough and fever. When conventional treatments failed, our doctor explored alternative options, eventually administering less common medications, but Henry's condition continued to worsen, and we were advised to prepare for the worst. Only one of us could be with him at a time, so Tracy and I took turns. My biggest concern was Kimberly, who had taken on a motherly role with Henry since his birth. She was devastated, spending much of her time in her room, clutching Henry's teddy bear. On the morning of day 8, I woke up to find Henry awake and looking at me. He smiled and asked for pancakes, which was a joyful moment for me. The nurse suggested starting with apple juice and toast, which Henry ate eagerly. From that point, he improved daily, and 3 days later, we were able to bring him home. It was a huge relief, especially for Kimberly, who was overjoyed and didn't want to leave his side. That was 16 years ago. Tracy and I are still happily married, despite life's ups and downs. Kimberly injured her ACL playing soccer in college, but eventually recovered. I've had an appendectomy and hernia surgeries, and Tracy had a scare with a lump in her breast that turned out to be benign. Kimberly went to Windett University to study nursing, while Henry attended nearby Tyler University to study communications. Kimberly graduated as a physician assistant and now works at a small clinic in Milton. Tracy and I had hoped for more children, but medical issues led to a hysterectomy for Tracy, so we focused on our 2 children and the radio station, where Tracy still works. Amanda and Chad married, but they divorced 5 years later after Chad's failed business expansion and a rumored affair. Amanda moved back to her old house across the field and resumed her business. One day, Amanda unexpectedly showed up at my office, wanting to advertise her business again on our station. Despite my initial hesitation, we agreed on the terms, and she recorded her commercials. When we finished, Amanda apologized for her past actions, attributing her behavior to Chad's influence. At first, I was surprised by Amanda's apology, but I appreciated it and agreed to be distant friends. We only interacted at town events, and, interestingly, Tracy and Amanda got along better than Amanda and I did. Amanda's business is thriving, though her personal life isn't. She's had 2 broken engagements. I sold Henry's house for $211,000 and used the money to build a new one. Lou still works at the station and has been sober for years. He's happily dating someone now. Jimmy moved to a larger station in Charlotte, where he's a top performer. He's engaged to a local girl and plans to marry in a couple of years. Although Jimmy doesn't visit Milton regularly anymore, he occasionally stops by incognito, and everyone knows it's him. Chad, who was always arrogant and vengeful, tried to get back at me after Amanda and I married. He convinced his parents to buy an FM station in Greenville, overpaying by $200,000. His lack of business acumen led to failure, and when his parents decided to sell the station, it was in bad shape. I bought it for $395,000. Many of Chad's newspapers failed, but the Milton Press still operates under new ownership, and the new owners and I have a successful advertising partnership. It's rumored that Chad is working for a newspaper in Maine, but his brother Michael now runs TriStar as Chad's father has retired. It's Christmas again, and we watch It's a Wonderful Life every year by the fireplace, using Henry's old lighter. I'm grateful for Henry's protection. I've only told this story a few times, and of course, only my family truly believes it. Whether others believe it or not doesn't matter to me. Since my car accident, I've felt that Henry has been watching over me as a guardian angel, and I'm thankful to have been his friend. Happy holidays, and as Tiny Tim said, God bless us, everyone.